Okay, yeah, for sure. So non-contact ACL injury typically defined as an ACL injury once there isn't any direct contact to the knee or the surrounding areas there. But that can also include an injury where an athlete gets like bumped in the upper extremity and it still leads to an ACL injury. So you have, I guess
That's still
three kind
called
of.
non-contact though, right?
Right. It's typically called indirect contact. So three kind of classifications. You have your pure contact injury where a running back runs through the hole, lineman dives into him, boom, ACL tears. That's one that there's just a lot of extraneous kind of factors. Then you have the second one where it's like your indirect contact. So athlete goes up for like a rebound, gets bumped in the shoulder, lands, and then ACL pops. So not necessarily a direct contact to the knee or the lower extremity, but still contact nonetheless. And then the third one is just like your pure non-contact injury. Wide receiver goes across the flat, catches the ball, decelerates, boom, ACL tear. Similar to like kind of Odell Beckham's, I think, from a couple years ago, where wasn't any sort of contact, lower upper extremity, just a pure non-contact. But from a theoretical perspective, and this is where a lot of this research has come from, we think that the indirect and the non-contact ones are the ones that are quote unquote preventable, whereas your contact type, and we'll get into that for the whole injury prevention side of things, and but the non-contact ones, there's just a lot of other factors. A 300-pound lineman dives into your knee, like there's not really much you can do at that point. But you could also make the argument that you could potentially, through some different strategies, have athletes avoid those types of situations in the first place. But that kind of gets into a whole nother tangent. But yeah, that's kind of the classical, I guess, classifications of ACL. So I've spent my time pretty heavily on the pure non-contact, but also too getting into some of the indirect contact as well, because that's things that our athletes are going to experience a lot. They're still going to get bumped. They're still might not be to the knee itself, but there's still perturbations that our athletes have to navigate, whether that's soccer, basketball, football, so on and so forth.
No, I 100% agree. And I had a colleague who he was working with women's lacrosse, and one of his
Another sport,
girls,
yep.
she got pushed from the back, like she was
Yep.
going to get a ball, pushed from the back in a penalty, like it was an illegal contact, but her knee, she wound up tearing her ACL, and the athletic trainer was like, "Oh, that's a non-contact injury," and he's like, "Whoa, wait a minute! Like, had that girl not gotten pushed in the back, that knee injury never would have happened." Like,
Sure. Yeah, that one we would define as indirect. So indirect
but it's not
contact.
indirect. Like they directly
Right.
got hit.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. That's just how it's
Yeah,
typically, I guess,
classified by
defined.
doctors, right? Like that's
Right.
it all trickles down from like, okay, what a surgeon would call it, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, within the history of it, you started talking about the 2000 and non-contact. Like, when was the different classifications? When did it start? How are we going about with this?
I think you really started to get those classifications kind of later on in that process. It was
Okay.
the early 2000s research. It was just really like the pure non-contact injury, right? Athlete goes to do a sidestep cutting maneuver and boom, ACL tears. Those are sort of the ones, or like the jump landings too. Athletes going up for a rebound, no contact at all, and then land, ACL pops. So that was really kind of the first kind of goal, is like the pure non-contact type of injury. How can we, one, predict the injury through various assessments and talk about some of the inherent limitations there, and then also two, kind of coinciding, okay, if we could predict, then in theory we could prevent, and then what are some, I guess, preventative strategies that we can do. So early 2000s research, you started to see a lot of like jump landing biomechanics research come out. Tests like the drop vertical jump, the landing error scoring system, some things that some of the listeners may be familiar with and have implemented before. And some of that research, at least initially, was pretty heavily focused in the adolescent female population, because that's where you see a lot of ACL injuries, and that kind of gets into a whole other tangent about how females may be at higher risk for males. A lot of people, speculate it could be anatomical, could be physiological, could be hormonal. I actually don't really buy into any of those three, because if you look at a lot of this research, it's female adolescent athletes as a whole, and I'm being very general here, don't necessarily have equal training opportunities as a male adolescent athlete for a lot of reasons. There's still some stereotypes about female athletes, weight training and the frequency in which they do it. But if you really look at a lot of these early studies, they don't necessarily control for training age. And they look at, male versus female risk factors, and females have more stiffer landing strategies or dynamic valgus. But we've seen through, tailored training, a lot of these risk factors sort of kind of get mitigated. So that's kind of, that's a whole separate tangent there. But essentially they were starting to look at, okay, what are some assessments that we could do that could identify athletes who would be at a higher risk or predicting, ACL non-contact injuries. And so some of the research in the early 2000s, again, looking at a couple of those tests, drop vertical jumps, landing error scoring system, tests that, in theory would be great to roll out for a full football team or for a full soccer club, things like that, to where I could do this test, I could screen, I could say this athlete's at high risk, this athlete's at moderate risk, this athlete's at low risk for injury, and then we provide our interventions based on that. Like in theory, sounds great. And there was a particular paper that came out on the mid 2000s that did identify. So there's around 210 adolescent female athletes. They were from some different sports: basketball, soccer, a couple of your more classic jump landing type of sports. I think there's volleyball in there as well. Nine of the athletes did end up going on and sustaining a non-contact ACL injury, and then the remaining part of the cohort did not. So you had your group there, and you had your larger group that didn't. And what they found is that of those 9, the dynamic knee valgus moment was significantly higher than in the non-injured cohort. And that paper really started to, it funneled through, got a lot of recognition.
What paper was that?
This is the Hewitt paper in 2005 out of the American Journal of Sports Medicine. If readers are interested, definitely can provide the citation, things like that. But that was really the first paper that started to get at, okay, here's a potential mechanism of a non-contact ACL injury. And I think since then, in 2005, that's really the thing that people look at, right? It's like, okay, where's the dynamic knee valgus? Where's the knee valgus? We need to train out of knee valgus. Like an athlete demonstrate that, oh boy, that's a red flag. And so and that really, like I said, that's about 2005, so about 18 years ago, around that 25 year-ish range. And ever since then, that's really been, from a grassroots level, you talk to parents, you talk to some coaches and stuff, that's what they'll tend to go to first. Is like, okay, when I see an athlete and they, have the knock knees or things like that, they're like, oh boy, that athlete's at a high risk, or that athlete needs to be trained out of that. And for better or worse, some of that has still kind of stuck around. But as you started to read more of the research, and there's been follow-up studies that have done similar types of analyses, different ages, different athlete cohorts, and they've done similar tests too, drop verticals, other sort of like sidestep cutting, things like that. And what we've started to see over the last 15 years is those other researchers who have done these, again, prospective studies, longitudinal, looking at those who did end up sustaining a non-contact versus those who are injury-free or control cohorts, actually haven't really been able to replicate those initial findings.
Really?
In terms of dynamic knee valgus or any sort of knee biomechanics actually being predictive of future non-contact ACL injury events. So
why is everybody saying that then?
I think honestly, just that was kind of the first, and one of the things too is like knee valgus is very easy to see, right? Like it's something that from a macro level, a coach can identify, a practitioner, someone who doesn't have experience can see, oh yeah, that person has knee valgus. Boom, that's something that I can easily see, and now I can try to quote unquote train that athlete out of it. That's where I think a lot of that comes from. It's very easy to see someone who has knee valgus or bad knee biomechanics, so on and so forth. So that's where I kind of think like that was something that someone could latch onto very easily and say, okay, that person's at a high risk. I can visibly see their knee valgus when they do any sort of drop landing or jump cutting, all that sort of stuff. That's why I think it's stuck around, because it's easy to see. But as I'll kind of talk about here in a second, the sensory motor aspect of it is you can't see it. Like you can't see someone has a bad working memory. You may be able to kind of glean a little bit, but you can't necessarily macroscopically see that compared to someone who just has bad biomechanics.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.